Hi, and welcome to what is going to be the beginning of what I think is a conversation sort of about the future of CMC. Though not exactly, because the future is here. This is going to be the first week of two that we're going to be reading from this book, Infinite Reality, which is written by some of, I would say, the leading authorities on virtual reality and how we respond to virtual reality and what we can do with virtual reality. And the honest truth is I know that virtual reality gets kind of a bad rap because it's a little bit cheesy, and we're going to talk about why that is, why it kind of looks cheesy. I saw a Community episode recently. It's not on NBC anymore. It changed networks, but and it was totally making fun of the concept of like being in virtual worlds and people who wear funny things on their heads and get the full body like sort of suspender situation where they like move around like this in their virtual world, and it was very funny because it was kind of ridiculous. But what I like is, and you're not going to read this part, that even though it seems ridiculous that people would immerse themselves in virtual worlds and it would have effects, the beginning part of this book that I didn't assign, there was just too much to assign, even though the entire book is great and really easy to read if you can do it. The first part of the book gives a little bit of historical context that sort of, but not entirely, makes it seem a little bit less ridiculous. That people are doing these things, and particularly that people are responding to virtual reality in the ways that they are, which is going to be kind of the focus of the next 2 weeks. For instance, it talks about how when film first came out, people responded to these, moving pictures, especially in theaters where everything was sort of blocked out as if it was real life. So when there would be a picture, even in a black and white, silent film of a train coming, everybody in the audience would go like this, right? Like they were in like a 3D movie. And again, one of the things I think it's important to appreciate about this is like every new technology is something that we're sort of challenging our brain to. And virtual reality, I think, is just like sort of the next step, right? Anyway, so I assigned for this section, I wanted you to read chapters 3 through 5, and I would say if we could, the theme of this section, if you will, is really what is it that makes virtual reality work? And if I can, I'm just going to start calling it too as VR right now. So how does VR work? And I want to talk about two different aspects of it working. We are going to focus a little bit on the technical features because I want you to have an appreciation for why sometimes it is a very strange experience because of certain technical constraints. And then we're going to talk about psychologically, the stuff that I really love. Psychologically, how is it that our brain responds to virtual reality? Okay, so chapter 3 gave all of the nitty-gritties about how you sort of set up a virtual reality system. Not to say they're all the same, but there's a couple of components, and your book lays it out into 3 different components that make it work. We've got tracking, rendering, and displays, okay? So tracking is essentially, it's very much like it sounds. So a virtual reality system has to be able to track your movements. It has to be able to track what you're doing so that it can adjust what you're seeing. So if you want to feel like you're immersed in a different world, and right, the only way that's going to work is if when you respond to that world, you're sort of seeing things as if it's responding back to you. So there has to be a system in place that sort of tracks your movement so it can keep up with you, okay? Rendering is the actual creation of the image itself. So when an image is rendered, basically it goes hand in hand with tracking. If I move my hand, right, tracking should tell the system that I'm moving my hands, but then what I should see through my headset or most likely a headset, actually. What I should see in my headset is I should see a rendering of my hand moving, and it should be moving, if it's good tracking and good rendering, about the speed at which I'm moving it, okay? The same thing is, if any of you have gotten a chance, it's not out yet, but actually if you're at WVU, we actually, in the computer science department does have an Oculus Rift, which is going to be the virtual reality that everybody can have in their house because it's going to be affordable and it's going to be the type of sort of like a game console, something that you can just purchase so that you can enjoy it virtual world from the comfort of your own home. So when I had on the Oculus Rift headset, what would happen is I could turn all the way around and I could actually see what was behind me. So it had actually moved. So basically I was in a roller coaster. It was like I was on a roller coaster, and if I turned my head, the headset was able to track that movement and then at the same rate that I was moving it, render an image of everything that's to the side of me and to behind me. The thing is that if there's bad rendering, if it's going too slow, if it's not updating things too quickly enough, you get what's sort of called a lag, which can actually make you feel sick. Your book gave an example of, imagine, think about rendering in other situations, like a GPS. Like, have you ever used GPS where you can actually see yourself on a map? So you could say, okay, GPS, like, where is my car right now on this map? And then as your car is moving, you can actually see the little dot sort of go at a particular pace because it's rendering, it's updating your car's location. And it's not such a big deal if there's a little bit of a lag there, right? Although hopefully your actual GPS that's giving you directions doesn't have too much of a lag. Same thing though here, but imagine though if the lag is actually where you move your hand and only a minute later do you actually see it, right? It can give you sort of a motion sickness feeling, especially if like you're turning your head and then a minute later or a couple seconds later, there's a lag in the display that you're seeing. So because of that, there's really, and I like your book, that your book points this out, there's kind of a movement in virtual, not a movement, whatever. Forget I say all this dumb stuff. You'll notice that a lot of things in virtual reality sort of look boxy and square and maybe not very sophisticated. And I think that's one of the reasons virtual reality kind of has like a bad name to it, because when VR looks like so primitive, right, and simple, because, you know, the people in there have like boxy features and they don't really look smooth like they're supposed to, right? It's kind of like, oh, why would anybody respond to VR in any sort of real life situation when everything looks so fake? Well, I want you to understand the reasons that they do that is because basically it takes longer, it takes less computer processing speed to render images that are simple. Your book gave you an example, which if you can find this on page 52, you can see like the examples of how, maybe not so great here, how these little faces, there's one that's really smooth and there's one that doesn't have as much feature in it because it has more of those boxes and stuff. Well, the one that's simpler is quicker to render. It's easier for the computer to render, so it can update the display in a way that won't make you sick, which is a good thing, right? And the reason I think that's also important to know is because I don't think it's going to be like that forever. As they're building like supercomputers and technologies that have better processing skills. That computer's got some mad skills. As they develop computers that have better processing capabilities, we will, I think, start to see more sophisticated virtual beings and environments. So, and finally, there's not much explanation for the third technical component of virtual reality, which is the display, which is kind of like, I mean, think about display on your computer, right? It's just really the screen that you're seeing it in. And one of the important things, as I've already mentioned with displays, is normally they're put into headsets, right? So that everything else is blocked out. In order for virtual worlds to actually work and actually make you feel like you're immersed, it needs to take you out of the current world and drop you into this other world where all you see is sort of this series of screens that's being, that's updating things for your vision. And they actually, the book will give you some funny examples of ways that this has been done in the past by, you know, strapping different things, like two different like Game Boys to goggles and things like that. And there's all different types of displays you could make. But okay, so that is technically, right, all the components that make VR work. From a technical standpoint. But the best part is the psychology of this. So here's the main question. Why would we, if we are normal, functioning beings with perfect mental health, why would we go into a virtual world and respond to it as if it's the real world? And things I'm not going to go into, but I want you to pay attention to in your book. The authors give some great examples of how real people do respond to virtual worlds, such that they will sweat through paper towels that they're holding while they're manning a virtual cliff. It's not a real cliff, and they know it's not a real cliff, but they can't help but respond to it as if it is real. And we respond to social interactions in virtual worlds much like we do in offline worlds, okay? So why is that? Well, the first thing I think is really important to know, and I bring this up in all my media classes actually, is that we are social beings. We are hardwired to be social. The way that we survive evolutionarily is by getting with other people. I don't mean like getting with them, although that's part of it, but we are not you think about the animal kingdom. There are social creatures that run in flocks, and there are less social or more solitary creatures like tigers. I don't know why I think of tigers, but I think they are, that are less social. And we are considered a very social species, and therefore everything in our brain on some level is kind of programmed to make us socially included, to connect with other people, okay? Having said that, this is a great example that your book brings up and gives me an excuse to bring in Wilson. If you haven't seen Castaway, I actually don't recommend it. It's so heart-wrenching because of this guy. But they bring up, basically it's about Tom Hanks, deserted island by himself for years and years and years. A lot of product placement too, hence the Wilson. But Tom Hanks gets marooned on this island and he is isolated. He has no social contact. And I don't remember how it happened, but this is supposed to actually be his bloody hand that he made into a face somehow. And this volleyball that happened to be on the plane that crashed and got him marooned on the island, all of a sudden has a face and he has a name, Wilson. And a lot of the movie is Tom Hanks conversing with Wilson and developing sort of this relationship with Wilson. And I hate to spoil it, but it ends in a very traumatic scene where, not the whole movie, but where he gets separated from Wilson and Wilson's kind of floating off to sea, and he's really torn up about this. But here's the thing, this is why it's a great example, Tom Hanks really wasn't crazy, and he recognized that Wilson was just a volleyball, and yet he still sort of had this inclination to interact with something. And the fact that he did give Wilson a face really helps with that. But, I was talking to some colleagues about this when Wilson came into my office. We noticed that some people get really uncomfortable when Wilson comes on the screen and they kind of laugh and make fun of it. And my theory is that's just because it touches us so deeply. Not that we actually did think Tom Hanks was crazy, but it's almost like a defense mechanism to how deep of a comment that is on our need to be social. That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. That, this sort of trauma that we're all so sad when Tom Hanks, or whoever his character's name was, loses his volleyball friend at the end, was something that I think deep down we could all relate to, and I think it really hits at our core because, like I said, we're all hardwired to be social. Your book also talks about some research that talks about how we respond to ostracism when somebody is excluding you socially. And they've done lots of lab experiments demonstrating that people will do just about anything to not feel excluded. It's not necessarily something that we're always consciously aware of. It's really just sort of this innate reaction we have. And funny enough, the way they usually do experiments like that is they do just a simple ball toss where they'll have people in the lab that, unbeknownst to another person, are trained to just throw the ball between themselves, but they never throw the ball to this other person, and that person feels excluded. And there are all sorts of interesting studies that have come out of that when we're trying to figure out just how far people will go to not be excluded, or what behaviors will they engage in to sort of repair their self-esteem after they've been excluded just from a simple ball toss with some strangers. This has also led into a lot of research of what's called the media equation. Sorry. Oh, see all that crying I did with Wilson earlier. Need to rehydrate. The media equation simply is media equals real life. And some very famous Stanford communication scholars did a lot of research looking at how we interacted with technology as if it was like a person. And they've also talked about how we interact with media figures, like we can develop relationships with media figures we've never met before as if they were friends. If any of you have heard of like parasocial interaction, this would apply to that. And in your book mentions, for instance, politeness studies where they've they've done things like put bows on computers and see how it affects how people interact with, yes, the computer itself, right? They've done things about how they'll have you play different games or do different tasks with a computer, which you know is a computer, but then sometimes they'll find that when they ask people to evaluate the computer's performance, people will hold back because they don't want to hurt the computer's feelings, even though they know it's a computer. I mean, I liken this to, like, have you ever had like a time when you've been mad at your car and you're just thinking to yourself, oh, the car's having a bad day. The car's not having a bad day. It's a car. But it's the idea that we are attributing different human characteristics to our technology. Why? Because we're hardwired to be social. Because even things that we are consciously aware are not real. Again, this isn't something that makes us unbalanced or crazy. It's quite natural. But we have a tendency to look for human behavior in all different types of interactions we have, even when they aren't true interactions, if that makes any sense. And this goes along with the idea of the theory of mind, right? We're always trying, whether it's with real people or things that we believe to be real, to try to figure out the motives, to try to attribute different motives or reasons that people do different types of things. Oh, she's doing that because she's flirty, or yeah, I shouldn't say she. He's doing that because he's flirty, or they must have done that because they don't like fish. I don't know. Man, I'm really on this island thing, I guess. Anyway, so interestingly enough, though, the theory of mind gets a little bit complicated in virtual worlds, and this is where we start going into what's really different about virtual worlds. And, you know, in virtual worlds, we have to make sort of the challenge is trying to figure out, well, what's a real being, what's a sentient being, and what's just an agent. So your book makes this distinction between avatars and agents. Avatars we think about as being something that has a person behind it, that it's a representation, it's a body for an actual person. Whereas an agent is just sort of a tool, that it's a shell, but it doesn't have anything in it. And in virtual worlds, right, we have to make different types of assessments about whether we're interacting with avatars or agents, because that could certainly affect how we behave towards them. And, you know, one neat thing that your book brings up is like, well, look, you know, we don't normally have to do this in real life. It's a much more relevant decision that we have to make in virtual worlds, but they brought up, this blew my mind, they brought up things like Terry Schiavo, who was a woman who was, no, sorry, it's my best friend. They brought up Terry Schiavo, who was a woman who was in a vegetative state, and, you know, really the debate around her body was whether or not her body was essentially now an agent or an avatar, right? If there was something deeper down in there. And so it's an interesting sort of philosophical thing that we wrestle with even outside of virtual reality, but obviously it's a much more common thing that we're having to size up when we're in virtual environments. All right, having said that, yeah, I guess we can move on. So make sure you read all that. I've only really focused on the first half of chapter 4, but there's some other good stuff that goes a little bit more deeply into how we make attributions of sentience and things like that. So please don't overlook that. Pay attention to that. But I want to move on now, finally, to chapter 5, which is, okay, great. So we're hardwired to treat things socially. How is it exactly that we know that we treat basically what happens in virtual worlds like we treat it what happens in real worlds? Not to say that what happens in virtual reality isn't real. I don't like that, but it's another conversation. Well, so the authors sort of talk about this at the beginning of chapter 5. Once they started studying virtual reality, they're like, well, how are we going to like convince other people that this is an important thing? Well, the best thing to do is to say that, hey, look, everything that we know about human behavior, we can reproduce it in the virtual world. So they actually took very well-known social psychological experiments, or communication experiments about the things we know about how people interact with other people, and they tried to reproduce them in virtual conditions. And by and large, they succeeded. And the chapter goes through several different examples of this. For instance, one of the examples, they talked about proximity. We know that people have different, treat people's personal space differently depending on what culture you are, depending on what gender you are, and we respond to space violations in different ways depending on who's violating our space, maybe what power they have, you know, things like that. And they did some experiments and found that even when you're in a virtual world and you have a virtual person sort of violating your personal space, you respond in very similar ways. And there's gender differences that hold up, and all different types of things. The more specific example that I'm going to bring up now, because it actually has directly to do with the article that you're going to read, it is the article you read, they talk about some research they did on mimicry. Another interesting finding in nonverbal communication is that people, especially if they like each other, tend to automatically mimic each other's behaviors. What's really cool about it is it's unconscious. So this would be like if you're in a job interview, and so you can't see, but trust me, I'm crossing my legs, and somebody crosses their legs. Unbeknownst to you, you're very likely to cross your legs, especially if it's a social influence thing. If you're trying to make the other person like you, because we actually tend to like people better when they mimic our behaviors too. But again, people usually don't know this. If you ask them if they did that later on, even if you have videotape showing that they did, most people are unaware that they do it. It's kind of this, not subconscious, but not entirely conscious behavior that people engage in, and psychologists actually consider it a really fundamental part of communication development. It's an important thing to do if you're part of our social human species. So what do you think they did to demonstrate that this happens in virtual worlds as well? Well, they set people up, and by the way, it's an important detail, it's called the chameleon effect, right? How we sort of take on the shade or the nonverbals of other people that we're interacting with. Well, exactly, they did exactly what they did in the offline experiments and these virtual reality experiments, where we could actually see that people in virtual settings would mimic the behavior of virtual others. And again, all of this, including all of the other examples in this chapter, just to summarize, are just getting at this one basic point, which is that we respond to interactions in the virtual world just like we respond to interactions in the non-virtual world. And the next chapters that I'm going to have you read for next week are going to focus on why this even matters. Why do we even care? Okay, great. So everything that happens there happens here. But just as a little bit of a preview, the neat thing is that the virtual world isn't the real world, and we have a lot more potential to work within it. So that's a very important finding for other things we want to do. Okay, I hope that was sufficiently vague enough to make you want to read some more. So, okay, we'll talk more about VR next time. Thanks. Bye.